Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure and honour to have a chance to talk to Keith Thomas, who I've known for some years now. Keith, when and where were you born?
I was born in Wales, in a village called Wick, in the Vale of Glamorgan, in January 1933.
Right, and people like to go back a generation or two, but some go back to the Norman conquests, in one case, Sir John Gurdon, but most people just go back to their grandparents or people they knew. Can you tell me something about your parentage as far back as you like?
If your name is Thomas, the problem of what they call nominal recognition is very difficult, so that I can't trace, or haven't attempted really, to trace the family back very far. But essentially, my father was a farmer, and his father was a farmer, and his father had, I think, begun as a farm labourer and become a farmer, all in this small area, the Vale of Glamorgan. My mother, her father was a schoolmaster who came from a farming family a little north of the main road, as you say, that's to say the northern end of the Vale of Glamorgan. But he had married a Scottish woman who came from Glasgow, who was a school teacher. They'd met, I think, when teaching together. And I know a little about my Scottish ancestors. Their surname was Moody, although I think the original name was said in McPhee, and one of them had been a sea captain, and they lived in the Isle of Bute. So at the age of 4, my mother took me up, and we went to the Great Empire Exhibition in Glasgow, which I remember very well, and then on to the Isle of Bute, where it rained all the time, and sat in Rest Bay. And there were 2 maiden aunts, great aunts, I suppose, sisters of my grandmother who lived there. And that was the extent of the Scottish connection, really. So my family otherwise were all Welsh and all farmers.
Did you know either of your grandparents well?
Well, my father's father, who was a farmer, I used to meet him when my father went into market in Bridgend on Mondays, and they met in the bank for some reason. And I was a very little boy, and my grandfather had a moustache and used to kiss me goodbye, and he had a very distinctive smell, which I now recognise as that of whiskey, because the Monday market day was a general occasion of a mild celebration. But my father's mother died when he was about 12. He was one of 7 children, 6 boys and a girl, and the 6 boys were brought up in conditions of extreme austerity, with flannel shirts, no underclothes, if you please, and pretty rough diet. My grandfather ate very well, but the boys didn't. Yeah, but the result of all that was that each of these 6 boys was put out on, set up on a tenant farm of their own. So by the standards of my grandfather, this was all tremendous success.
Tell me a little, tell me something about your parents.
Well, my father was a very intelligent man with what I could only say quite an acute analytic mind, but he left school at about 13. My mother was a university graduate from the University of Cardiff, not a very distinguished career there, but she did English there. And she came to teach and run the village school in Marcross, which was near Wick, which was a tiny school, I suppose, about 30 or 40 pupils probably. And they met there. And I suppose my mother always saw herself as the educated one, and my father had a slight inferiority complex about that, somewhat unjustified in my view, because I think he was rather more intelligent than she was really. But there was a sort of painful period of self-education on his part. I mean, I remember in the house there were volumes of Carlyle's History of the French Revolution and so on, which had been prescribed reading by my mother. I don't think he got very far with that, and he never became a really bookish person. But he took an intelligent interest in the world, and he was a good farmer. He began on a small tenant farm in Wick, but when I was about 2, they moved to Lancarvan to a rather bigger one, 250 acres, which belonged to the University of Wales because it had originally belonged to the Welsh Church. And when the Welsh Church was disendowed by Lloyd George, the land went to the university. So we were tenants of the university, and there used to be an annual visitation, something I'm quite aware of later on, in other Oxford contexts, but we were on the receiving end then. And I do remember my mother asking, could we have a bath room, or bath? And the sort of rather grand principal of University of Aberystwyth said he'd always thought that a hip bath was quite adequate. In fact, we didn't have, I mean, I remember when the water was put in, and I remember when the electric light was put in. And our early reading was by the light of an Aladdin lamp. Anyway, my father became, after very difficult times in the 1930s, then came the war, and of course that was a very good time for farmers. And he prospered. But he was still of a sort of cautious disposition, so it remained a farm of 250 acres, which by the ordinary course of events I should have inherited. But I thought,
did you have siblings?
Yes. I had a younger brother, I have a younger brother, and 2 sisters, the younger of whom died at the age of 9. But my younger brother, of course, succeeded to this, yes, I mean, the domestic situation really was that because I turned out to be rather bookish and completely hopeless on farm from an early stage, my mother very much encouraged and championed that. I mean, she was a very reluctant convert to agricultural life, though she worked extremely hard as somebody who cooked meals for an unknown number of men, no notice at all. But my mother encouraged me, as it were, academically. So, and my father, I think, probably thought I was a bit of a wimp, really. Whereas my younger brother reacted against this, and then the stock pattern emerged, and he was the one who wanted to be the farmer. And he was perfectly intelligent, he rather renounced academic things. So when the time came, my younger brother succeeded at this farm. She then built up enormously, and he was more dashing by temperament. So he was prepared to borrow money from the bank, which was something my father would never get in debt. And his good fortune was to borrow a lot of money in the 60s and 70s, time of inflation, and buy a great deal of land. So he's now easily the largest landowner in the Vale of the Walden. runs 3,500 acres or something like that. Which my father, and it began with buying the Pancras farm, the farm which got the University of Wales, which my father was absolutely flat against. He thought end up in the workhouse.
You mentioned bookishness, and you also mentioned paraffin lamps, and it's evident that you're myopic, short-sighted from your glasses. What age is there any connection between these things? In other words, James Campbell, who I just interviewed, also, he was actually born myopic and diagnosed very early. At what point did you start wearing glasses?
Well, it wasn't diagnosed till I was about 10 or 11, I should think. I grew up in a world where anybody caught reading was told they'd immediately be ruining their eyes. And well, you know more about myopia than I do. I don't know whether it was a result of early reading or not.
Were you doing a lot of sort of lamplight reading early on?
I suppose so, yes. I mean, I can't remember when I couldn't read, and I did read a lot.
And what sort of, apart from the works of Thomas Carlyle, were you reading?
Well, I didn't read the works of Thomas Carlyle. Well, I read, my mother was pretty good on knowing what you should read up to about the age of 9. So works like The Wind in the Willows and Treasure Island and all these sort of classic children's stories I read. And I then went on, I suppose, to a lot of, as it were, popular history. And there was a Marshall Islands story. And then the boys' book of heroes, that kind of thing. I was very hot on heroes. And of course, although there we were in the Vale of Walden, the imperial background was quite important. I mean, in school there was this great map of the world with a great chunk of it pink. Yes. And one had no doubt at all about our superiority to other nations.
There was no plan to send you off in that imperial venture?
No. I think there was a rather lunatic idea that I might become a naval officer. This was that's unsuitable for so many points of view, but nevertheless, I do remember my father saying something, well, he's not going to be a father, he's not going to be a naval officer.
I mean, nature and the natural world and animals and so on has been quite a large theme in your work later on, and I know you love Wordsworth and so on. Is it right to picture you as a little boy who was bookish but was also spending your time hunting for birds' eggs and things?
Absolutely. I mean, we ran free, loose, in the fields, and of course there was virtually no traffic on the roads at all. I spent an enormous amount of time out of doors and making sort of huts in the wood, and I'm afraid also stealing birds' eggs. But there were very few children in the village, very few. And my chief companion, apart from my brother, who was 2 years younger, was a boy called Billy Tucker, who was the son of a farm labourer who worked on the farm. And he was very much better at this than I, so that he went up the tree and said, there are only 2 eggs. Because we had the principle you always have 1 egg. And there are only 2 eggs, so, how can we have 1 each? And I do remember telling saying, take them both. I was quite unregenerate. I feel quite ashamed about that, of course. But yes, and he could catch, I saw him catch rabbits with his bare hands and so forth. So I spent a lot of time in a sort of camping in a modest way or playing in there was a river and fishing for eels and trout and so on. I had an idyllic childhood really from that point of view.
I mean, one's always as an interviewer trying to see links, and I mean, do you think all this natural interest and so on fed into your later?
Well, I suppose so, of course. Initially, I did react against all that very strongly, because by the time I was a teenager and really studying quite seriously out of interest, I was also potential labour on the farm. So the holidays were always the most terrible battle between my father and me as to, there was I sitting on the deck chair reading a book, and there was all this corn waiting to be carried and stripped and so forth. So leaving the countryside was liberation for me at the time. And I suppose there was a faint sort of spurious nostalgia about my return to it in a literary way. But it also means, I do know the difference between ash and oak or wheat and barley and so on, and could identify a lot of birds. I used to compete in the Young Farmers Club, because I was tractor driving, though I'd never learned to drive a car. And the other thing, which of course is extremely following Thomas and wet, the wildflower identification, which I was so good at then. So it left its mark. Yes.
What was your first memory? I mean, apart from sort of the waving of the trees above your pram, but actual event.
Well, in terms of public life, I remember the village sports to celebrate the coronation, I suppose, of George VI. And I mean, and more, and very clear, it's not my earliest memory at all, but I have a very clear memory of listening to a speech by Neville Chamberlain in 1939.
So you were 6 then?
Yes, saying, that I've been received, or whatever, we're now at war. And I was very disappointed because he didn't say, I declare war, which is what the boys used to say. And I also expected fighting to break out in the road outside instantly. So those are the public memories. But I suppose, of course, I remember going to school. I started school, the village school, when I was 4.
Was this the one your mother was teaching?
No. That was, she taught in a school near Wick, and we moved from Winton Carlton, and she gave up teaching by this stage, longer than the time. No, it was a similar village school. They used to have a board saying how many pupils there were, and it usually said 48 or 46. And there were 3 classes.
Were there any teachers even then who remember or had any influence, particularly influence?
Well, I remember all the teachers. The entrance class was Miss Griffiths, and the middle class was Miss Thomas, and the headmaster who taught the top class was Mr. Davis. I think I was a rather sort of prized exhibit there, partly because it was a very little school, a very little village, and my mother had been a school teacher, and that sort of created an atmosphere of awe. So I was sort of handled with kid gloves, I suspect.
And encouraged.
Yes, and I peaked then, really.
Downhill all the way.
Yeah. My greatest achievement was to have got 150 out of 150 for arithmetic in what nowadays they call the 11 plus. So I passed top of the county and then went to the Barry County School. And that initially was much more traumatic because this was going from this cosy rural haven into a much busier urban seaport, as it still was really, with a very, by my standards, rough end. And it was school, there were A forms, B forms and C form, and the C form was extremely rough. And I developed a stammer, no doubt, in reaction to, actually to the prospect of it. Never actually completely thrown it off, in fact. But, initially, that was difficult.
Were you a day boy?
Yes, it was only day boys, they were all day boys, yes. And that was quite a business. I had to get up fairly early, and then there was somebody from the village who worked in Roos, which is on the way to Barry, and took me there, and then I caught a bus from Roos to Barry. And then in the afternoon, there was the great horror of having to hold your hand up and say, can I go, because the country boys, as they were called, who were a little minority, were allowed to leave about 10 minutes early to get what was the Oakley bus. And this always was a matter of great irritation to the teacher. So then I got the bus back to Aberthaw, and then walked up about a mile and a half home.
This was it seems to be a rather special school because it produced a number of historians, as you know, John Habakkuk and so on. What was special about it?
Well, I think the first point was that the Welsh, or certainly the Glamorgan grammar schools, were culturally very important. Very few people in Glamorgan would have been sent away to public schools, given the social structure of the place. There were 2 Welsh public schools, Brecon and Dugbury, but on the whole, the people who went there were the children of middle class who failed 11 plus. So the schools, in the first instance, did shovel up all the talent in the area. Barry had had a very distinguished headmaster between the two wars called Major Edgar Jones. And it was his time that Habakkuk and Glyn Daniel, the Cambridge archaeologist, were there. And then I think the tradition continues. Owen Barry there have been 3 professors of economic history at either Oxford or Cambridge from Habakkuk. David Joslin, who was professor in Cambridge and died young, and then Martin Daunton, who is now a master at Trinity Hall. He was there. In my case, looking back on it, I can see that some of the teachers were better than others, but there were some very dedicated people there, and I was fortunate. I had a very good history master indeed. I mean, I think behind the great majority of academics, there is a schoolmaster or school teacher.
Yes, exactly.
And there certainly was in my case.
What was his name?
His name was Tyvion Phillips, and he was, I suppose, a young man. They didn't seem young to me, who'd come from Swansea, and he was leftish, pillar of the Labour Party, and he was intellectually ambitious for his pupils. And I remember the textbook we used was M.M. Rees, Tudors and Stuarts. But he leavened that up. I mean, I remember he lent me a copy of the Modern Quarterly, which was the communist journal, which contained the article by Christopher Hill on the English Revolution 1640, which I could see was something rather different.
You read this before you went for your interview at Oxford?
Yeah, but it wasn't, not in that spirit.
No.
I mean, I had read it. And he also introduced me to Tawney Religion, The Rise of Capitalism, which was a very influential book as far as I was concerned. And there was a boy in the previous year who'd sacked the Babel Scholarship and got an exhibition, David Rees. He became a monk, died recently. And he, but I wasn't going to do history, I might say, and luck, chance plays such a large part in people's lives, really. I remember I had to say what subjects I wanted to do for higher, as it was called, A-level then. And I was going to do English, French and Latin, which would have been disastrous because I'd have done Latin without any Greek, French without any other foreign language, and English is very speculative. And I was on the way to the place where you had to register your choices, where I was intercepted by Tyvion Phillips, who said, "You're going to do history, aren't you?" And I've always been complete feather in the wind, so I said, "Yes, of course, I'll do history."
You say that you've been a feather in the wind several times in your interview with Maria.
Yes.
It doesn't fit with my knowledge of you, Keith.
Well, I do have a tendency to believe the last thing I've read.
I don't believe that either.
Anyway, I was, I mean, maybe he put some more rational arguments to me too. So I changed, and I did English history and Latin. And then the sixth form history with him was very good. And then in my first year in the sixth, it suggested I should try for Oxford. The master was very against that because there was a slight touch of not for the likes of us, and anyway it's too soon. And so I entered for Balliol, not just because anyone I'd heard of, really. I was we did get a copy of the University Gazette, and I did look through the list of all these awards, and I was very tempted by something called the Brace Girdle Exhibition in St. Catherine. It's just because I like the name. But anyway, I went in for a scholarship, and lo and behold, I got it.
I mean, at the school, which is at times very important, just one or two further questions about that. Firstly, were there any particular hobbies you had then? I mean, music, acting, politics, anything?
Well, no, one of my great regrets, and something I'm desperately trying to make up in later years, is that in my childhood, at home, and indeed in school, there was absolutely no music and no art, none at all. Absolutely not. I mean, not out of, they just simply didn't exist. So all that came to me later. I played cricket and wasn't hopeless at it. and enjoyed that very much. I read novels, I suppose. I wasn't at all
You weren't
interested.
an actor or drama?
Yes, I was an actor.
Mm.
I was an actor, and there was a quite modestly famous actor who was exactly contemporary of mine, and whom I out-auditioned for a part, a man called Keith Baxter, who he plays Prince Hal in the Orson Welles film Chimes at Midnight.
Mm.
He's a playwright and so forth. Yes, I love play reading, acting and debating. There was a literary and
Yes, I was wondering.
there was a literary and debating society.
Mm.
So all that brought out a certain competitive, contentious element.
You touched on music, which you discovered later. Was that at Oxford or after that?
I think that was really after I got married, because Valerie, my wife, was very fond of music. And now, in fact, most evenings we listen to music, and it's wonderful. And,
is there any particular music you...
Well, I think my tastes are pretty conventional, that's to say. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Stravinsky, but I'm afraid I'm not very much contemporary music.
And does some people use music in some vaguely intellectual way? They either write to music or they listen to a bit of music and then write, or others just use it to relax from thinking.
Well, I hate the idea of background music. I'm terribly against that, and partly because I think it doesn't help the work, and certainly it doesn't help the music. So if it were music, I'd want only music.
And you never played in that?
No, I've got no manual dexterity.
The other thing is, I didn't ask about your parents. Wales is, to the English, a vaguely, Scottish, a vaguely religious sort of place. Did your parents have any religious leanings?
They were Anglican, or to be precise, Church of England in Wales, which is something slightly different. And my father was a church warden. My mother, after the death of my younger sister, she died when I was 9, when I was in the army. And that was a terrible experience for her. And the local vicar, I suppose it was, I think, behaved insensitively. I don't know, I wasn't there. But anyway, she went completely off religion of any kind whatsoever after that. And far from driving at her religion, it had the opposite effect. So she was a flat unbeliever. And my father was a sort of conformist, for I would have said as much social reasons as any other. And I started off CEV in Wales, as they were. That, of course, was in itself rather a statement in those parts, because the division between church and chapel was a very important social and indeed political one, because in that part of the world, in those days, church meant conservative and chapel meant liberal, possibly Labour. And it certainly was a class difference. So that was what I inherited, and I even taught in a Sunday school when I was about 13, and I was confirmed. And I went to, when I was in the army, I went to church occasionally, and when I was in Balliol, I went to chapel occasionally. But after that, completely dropped, not at all.
I mean, if you were forced to tick one of the boxes of agnostic, atheist, or believer, what would you tick?
Well, I suppose I'm an atheist, really, but having said that, I have a considerable affection for church architecture and church music, and I subscribe to the upkeep of sundry churches. So it's a bit complicated. I would hate to see them go. One of my favourite buildings, I discovered was also one of the favourite buildings of Jerry Cohen, the philosopher who died a week or two ago, is Cholsey Church, which you see as you go from Didcot to London on the train. I've never been there. You would spoil it if I went. But the silhouette of it is enchanting. So I have a strong, not sentimental, aesthetic appreciation, I think, of church architecture and of church music.
And the rituals of, for instance, when you were Master of Corpus,
did I go to chapel? Almost never, actually. I mean, I went if there was a particularly, if there was a preacher.
Were you not obliged to? Sort of?
No, quite tolerant. I'm sure they were disappointed, but quite tolerant. I mean, then I went to carol service and that sort of thing. I think that, I mean, I have views on all this. I think that although the secular outlook seems to be the only one which intellectually makes any sense at all, I think that the secular world is extremely deficient in unifying rituals of one kind and another. I mean, the point about the church service, in principle, was that all the parish was gathered together. Now there is no such occasion, and in the colleges that was, of course, particularly the case. So I lament that. I lament the absence of a satisfying secular ritual of burial. I mean, I think funerals are very important. But I'm afraid when they began the resurrection of life and all that, I can't believe that.
I often ask particularly scientists their view on those who are very ardently secular, in other words, those of the Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens persuasion.
Well, I have no desire to disabuse other people of what gives them comfort, even if I happen to think it's a spurious source of comfort. And I am not offended by the presence of churches or the knowledge that they are used for religious purposes. And I greatly respect most of the Christian ethic. I'm less respectful of the ethics of some other religions.
I won't probe into that. I mean, when you talked about intellectually finding the secular world the only one possible and yet deficient, it's a sort of one of the sub-themes in your book, Religion, the Decline of Magic, and you discover the loss of belief, or there wasn't much anyway, but do you think that in any way was linked to your own movement from some belief to no belief?
Well, by the time I embarked on that, I was not moving. I was quite settled in a state of disbelief. And I suppose it could be said, and my critics certainly have said, that it meant that I did less than justice to the religious belief of people in, say, the 15th century. And I remember one reviewer saying there was no sense of the numinous there. I'm never absolutely sure what the numinous means, but I would agree with that reviewer. There is no sense of the numinous. And I think I probably was a little bit too literal in my account of all that. But it wasn't designed. The book wasn't designed as an atheist or agnostic tract at all. It was just meant to be an account of how people thought at the time.
Were you surprised when one of the things that surprised other people was that how limited and garbled the beliefs of ordinary Englishmen in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries were?
No, not at all. I wasn't surprised, actually, because I suspect that if you interviewed people coming out of church today and said, just run through the Ten Commandments, they might not do too well either.
We're always gullible. Okay. Let's move on then to Balliol. I mean, when did you do national service? Before?
Well, I got my scholarship at Balliol when I was just 17.
Yes.
And the college expected people to come up after they'd done national service, and that was my saving really. If I'd gone up at 17, I'd have sunk without a trace. So I then, having got this, equipped with this scholarship, which then gave, which then qualified you for a state scholarship, I didn't need to do higher school certificate. I don't actually have higher. I don't have higher school certificate, and I don't have a D film. So that's exactly. So I spent the two kind of enjoyable terms in school, reading around and doing other subjects and so forth. And then I went to the army in the autumn of 1950. And that was another trauma initially. I was went into the infantry, initially the Welsh regiment, and was posted to Brecon, Daring Lines. And I can't pass the Brecon beacons now without recalling those days. And I found the first couple of weeks in the barrack room pretty ghastly. I mean, not so much the military routine as the company of the unregenerate. And I mean, although I always thought of Barry as quite rough, I mean, I then realised what rough actually was. That wouldn't bother me at all now, but it bothered me quite a lot then. And then, by great good fortune, I was transferred to the Welsh Fusiliers, because if I'd stayed in the Welsh Regiment, I should have gone to Korea, and might well not be sitting here now. And instead, I went to Jamaica, and I became a corporal in the orderly room, and sort of spied on the middle of the web there, and played cricket, and explored the island.
Well, I'd love you to tell me something about Jamaica, because Sarah and I at the moment are doing research on Jamaica. We've discovered that my family was one of the biggest families in Jamaica for 2.5 centuries.
Where were they?
She tell you, I mean, all over.
Yes.
The first white child born in Jamaica was my 12th generation grandfather, James, in 1656, and 1665. And
that's
so
very well. That's very early, because the English only went there in 1655.
I mean, yes, exactly. They straight away, the first child, white child, and they owned these huge estates. And we have their family papers and slave books and so on.
Really?
And they continued intermarrying with all the top Jamaican families for centuries, and didn't really leave. Some branches didn't leave till the late 19th century. So we're doing a lot of work on Jamaica. So tell me what it was like to be there.
Well, the camp was Upper Park Camp, which was just outside Kingston. And the first thing was very beautiful. You had a marvellous view of the Blue Mountains, the hills, and then the sea the other side. And the climate was, I thought, delightful. I never found it too hot. It was never cold. Kingston was rather a seedy place, I suppose, and it was a large red light area, very popular with some of my colleagues. The poverty was pretty obvious, though one had the impression of a great sort of cheerfulness, really. I mean, this no doubt was a total sort of pastoral fantasy, but there was, so far as I could see, relatively little political discontent. Though there was some. I mean, after all, the reason the army was there was to police the Caribbean, and periodically battalions were sent out to Grenada, Antigua, and Michigan, and so forth, basically to put down what we euphemistically call labour problems. But I was very struck by the beauty of the place, we went on leave. We went to the cockpit country.
Yes.
And Matt indeed were captured by the Maroons because we weren't supposed to go there. And had a sort of mock trial in which we discussed the details of the treaty of 1730, whenever it was. So, I mean, I thought the landscape ravishing, but the social setup pretty
And the food
unsatisfactory.
was nice too.
Well, we had army food, of course,
Yeah,
so that I think would be the same
And the
anywhere.
music,
But yes, I was conscious of yes, yes, indeed, yes, yes, I like that, and the cricket was on
Was it? I mean, were there noticeable vestiges of the long history of slavery? Was there caste-ish? I mean, it had this complex caste system.
Well, I didn't know Jamaican society well enough. What I could see at a glance was that there was an incredible ethnic mixing, so that you could, if you got enough people, you could line them up and go from whitish white to blackish black without noticing the difference between any two in the line, as it were. So it seemed to be extremely mixed, but no doubt there were all sorts of distinctions which I think I probably wasn't aware of. And anyway, we were in the camp for most of the time, and we were just let out on weekends.
Yeah, another impression Sarah's got is that because the slaves had no incentive to work hard, and indeed they sort of foot dragged as much as possible for obvious reasons, there was a generally laid back, relaxed, manana sort of attitude.
That was absolutely the style. And when one went into the countryside, you were very conscious of that. That's why I say that things were rather cheerful. I mean, people were not bothered. At the same time, there was a certain amount of violent crime and violent punishment. And the only time we were issued with live ammunition was when there was a very spectacular hurricane, which, among other things, blew down the walls of the prison. And we were sent out to try and recapture the prisoners, which we totally failed to do, of course. But they were hanging people there all the time.
Okay, well, let's come back to England then, and Balliol. I mean, you actually, we missed the interview you had to get in, because there's something written about your first encounter with Christopher Hill.
Well, I remember, as people do, the line entrance interview very well. I waited in one room, which I think belonged to somebody called Hugh Leach, whom I never met, who was a lecturer there. And I remember chiefly because there were 2 volumes of Poeck's King Henry III and the Lord Edward, a magnificent book, a handsomely produced book. And in I went, and there were a number of people, it was not quite clear who was who. But the master, David Insecure, was there, and Christopher Hill, and not Dick Southern, who was my tutor, but who was, I think, on leave then, or still ill in the hospital, Hugh Stretton, and Roger, A.B. Roger, and they were my interviewers. And the story I was always reproached with afterwards by Hugh Stretton was that I was asked, what did I do in the holidays? And I said in thick Welsh accent, and I didn't ever have any holidays because we worked on the farm with them. But the interview went quite well. I had read a book. I mean, Tyler Phillips was alert enough to know that it helped to have an answer when somebody said, what have you been reading lately? And I had read D.B. Quinn's Raleigh and the British Empire, which is a volume in the Teach Yourself History series. So I was asked about that by Christopher Hill, who clearly approved of Quinn. And that went all right. And I remember Keir asking me what sort of history did I like best, and I said social history. And then he said, and so what were the main development in social history in your period? And I said, I shouldn't say, the rise of the middle class. So this wasn't an interview of any intellectual sophistication. However, was then sitting the night, I think, sort of in a very gloomy room, which I was sharing with somebody else. Somebody actually went on and became, he didn't go to university, he went to New College. He was called Keith Thompson. You can see how we were allocated to share the same room. And we were sitting there, and Christopher Hill appeared in the evening and said to me, if we were to give you anything, you don't want to go on and do the bloody higher school certificate. And I was so sort of amazed that it got to say bloody. Anyway, then on the Monday morning, I got a letter from Christopher, typically in a little brown envelope, scribbled on a piece of paper, saying, may I be one of the first to congratulate you on the Brackenbury Scholarship we've finished off. So, whoopee.
Were you still in the college then when you got this letter, or at home?
No, I was at home.
Oh.
But I got it on the Monday. I mean, of course, you went up and sat the exam for a week in Keble Hall. A very daunting experience with hundreds of people.
Mm. So there was a written exam and then an interview.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. Then, so you started, were there any of your, starting with your contemporaries, I mean, at Balliol, who you kept in touch with or were particularly close to or want to talk about?
Well, the contemporaries who are well known were included Raphael Samuel, who was my year, and we used to have breakfast together every day. And
His sort of personal demeanour and style is very different from yours by observation, and but your interests overlapped obviously. And do you have a high regard for him as a historian?
Yes. I mean, he was very chaotic.
Yes.
Sort of absolutely chaotic. The essays were never finished, and the sort of paper.
His hair was like that.
Yes. And indeed, he had a year out, so we didn't take schools the same year because he was advised to go off and cool down a little bit. But he was very precocious. I remember having coffee in his room after lunch, and while he was making the coffee, I was glancing vaguely at his books. And then I saw Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which happened to be a set book for prelims. But the inscription inside it was, to Raphael on his 8th birthday. So he was a good deal more precocious than I was, and indeed younger. And he was, he was communist then. And I wasn't at all, I suppose, but I was very interested. I went to a few meetings, or indeed even became an officer of something called the OU Past and Present Society, which had hitherto been known as the OU Karl Marx History Society. But I had been talking with him. And the other sort of well-known person was Charles Taylor, Chuck Taylor, but he was
philosopher.
Yes, he was PPE. But I had a number of very good friends as an undergraduate. Yeah.
I mean, another person I'm not so sure is absolute the same year, who I've interviewed recently, which was Lord Bingham, Tom Bingham. I sort of gathered he was born in the same year as you, but he may not have done the national service, so he may have been a year ahead or behind you.
He was, I think, probably 2 years behind me.
Ah.
I think 2 years. Certainly one.
Because the curious thing is that in his interview he said, I came up to read history, but I discovered after a while that I wasn't good enough to read history, so I read law. In your case, certainly in the interview with you, it says you came up really to be a lawyer. And
yes.
You discovered you weren't good enough and you became a historian.
No, I didn't discover I wasn't good enough. I was interviewed. No, I applied offering history to read law, because I was going to be a barrister. And I was interviewed by the Baylor Law Don, who was called Theo Tyler, and I knew there was something strange about this man, and I was too stupid to work out what it was, which was, of course, that he was totally blind, which somebody told me about it after all. And anyway, then I went to historians, and they said, we see you all want to read law. You don't want to read law, do you? So I, of course, further in the wind, said, no. So that was the extent.
I see. You didn't.
But no, but I've always been quite interested in the law in a way, and
You've
the legal
been quite a
profession.
good barrister with your
I
argument.
don't know. No,
Character, but there seemed a crossover at that point.
yes,
But Bingham was behind you.
yes. Morris Keane is the year after. Now they, I knew them of course, and liked them very much, but they both were not in the same year, which was quite a point. And they also, I belonged to a society. There was a debating society in Balliol, rather pretentious one. They wore little red bow ties, corduroy ties, called the Arnold Society. And there was a tremendous split in the Arnold Society. And one lot hived off and became the Brackenbury Society, and after all the people concerned had gone down, they reunited and is now the Arnold Brackenbury Society. And that was really a social split. And so the smart set were the Brackenbury, and I suppose that Tom and Morris were the smart set really.
But you weren't.
No.
Which of the teachers, you mentioned Dick Southern, I mean, who really influenced you as an undergraduate in teaching?
Well, as an undergraduate, Christopher Hill, undoubtedly. I mean, I had interesting relations with the others. Dick Southern, who I got to know very much better later, because of course he came to be president of St. John's and I was a fellow there. And I knew him very well and liked him very much. As a tutor, he was rather more remote, and he threw you in at the deep end. I mean, I'd done no medieval history at all, of course. And what he did, you only did an essay once a fortnight. And the first essay was on Asser's Life of Alfred. The next was on the Regularis Concordia, which you will remember was a monastic agreement. And the next was on Domesday Book, and then the next was on Walter Daniel's Life of Aylward and Rivaux, in other words, all on sources. So I hadn't the faintest idea about the general, and indeed in my third year I went back to him and said, could I write 4 essays on topics of my choice? So we did the Baron's Revolts and the Norman Conquest and that sort of thing, and that was my best subject anyway. And then on the modern end, Hugh Stretton was easily the most sophisticated of the tutors, and was famous for setting essay questions like for 19th century, 20th century history, which is the better portrait of Mr. Asquith, the one in the hall or the one in the senior common room? one portrayed a sort of Victorian senator and the other Edwardian drunk.
Well, this was an internal question, it wasn't for the university.
No, it was there. Well, there was, of course, extreme contempt for the schools, for the examinations. And the only time I saw Christopher Hill lose his temper was when one of our fellow undergraduates said about some essay topical when that come up in schools. And he was very cross indeed, said you were here to study history and to do the schools. So there was a sort of official insouciance towards exams.
Balliol was the place, everything was ranked within Balliol.
Well, it was, I mean, at the freshman's dinner, we were addressed by Sir David Lindsay Keir, who impressed upon us that we hadn't come to Oxford, we'd come to Balliol. And there was a good deal about tranquil consciousness of effortless superiority. And what it did, it was rather heady winders, but what it did was to give people tremendous intellectual self-confidence. And of course, Balliol was a college from which a large proportion of the leading historians had come. So, I mean, the History Society, we had Namia and Toynbee, Tawney, all that, the real grandees. So one did feel one was absolutely in.
And they came to talk at the History Society.
Yes. In the middle of Tawney, I missed Tawney, that was before my time, but there were a lot of Richard Pins, a lot of really outstanding people. And you felt that Balliol was the centre of it all. And Christopher Hill was, of course, fanatical Balliol man, in that whatever his political or other views, the college of he trumped everything. And essentially, you couldn't be wrong if you were a Bayer man, however fascistic.
That's interesting. I mean, your picture of the supervisions with Christopher, I think, fits with. I've read another account which is identical, more or less, which doesn't conform to modern RE requirements of supervisions.
None of my tutors would have satisfied quality assessment, or whatever it's called. All would have failed.
Because I mean, your account was that he didn't tell you what to do, and he didn't suggest reading, and he didn't make any comments.
He suggested, he expected you to choose your essay subject. He would suggest some topics, some reading. But having once suggested to me that I should read something which I then discovered existed only in the library of Trinity College Dublin, he was less forthcoming about it. And he was, he didn't make many comments, no.
How did that stimulate you into the
Well, I just had the feeling all the time that nothing but the best would do. I suppose, I mean, it was the chemistry of these encounters is very subtle. But he was just he was somebody I wanted to think well of what I did. So it was good. And of course, I knew that he did know everything. He had read everything. There's no question about that. He wasn't idle in that sense at all. His room was strange because although it was lined with books, there was never a paper on his desk. It was absolutely clear. How do you manage that? I don't know.
I used to go to his lectures too. He had a stammer, didn't he?
Yes, he did, which was rather more obvious in the lectures. Yes.
Did you go to his lectures?
I went to some, but they were not particularly notable events for me. But I mean, the lectures I remember were John Prestwich on early medieval history, which were very original. Habakkuk was a first-rate lecture. But again, Baylor was very sort of sneaky. He was very sneaky about university. He'll say, well, there's so-and-so, but that's at 9 o'clock. You can't possibly make that. And then, well, you wouldn't want to be going to those. So there wasn't very much outside the college which was recommended.
The famous lectures like Isaiah Berlin and H.P.
I never heard an Isaiah Berlin lecture. I didn't hear a Taylor lecture until I was at Donna, I suppose. I did go to, I went to a lecture by Taylor on the causes of the First World War. And after ostentatiously putting aside the lecture and rolling up his sleeves to show there were no notes, he then said that he wasn't going to talk about the causes of the First World War. He was going to discuss why there was peace before and afterwards. I remember that. But I didn't fall under the spell of Taylor. Trevor Roper's lectures I had to some.
They were good.
Yes, they were very narrative. It was the narrative of the Civil War, of the Civil War. And I think probably the subtleties of that escaped me at the time.
And one event which overlaps with my last interview, you entered for the most prestigious history prize, the Gibbs Prize, and shared it with James Campbell. Is that right?
That is true. Yes, as I understand it, I know that the two examiners were Betty Kemp, modernist, and Lionel Butler, medievalist. And I was the medievalist choice, and James was the modernist choice. Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes. I also did, and I mentioned it because it actually set me on a path, I did a University Prize essay, a stand-up essay, which they prescribed the subject. The subject was Anthony Wood, of whom I'd never heard, who was a 17th century Oxford antiquarian, and all his manuscripts are in body in a beautifully legible hand. And I had a very, very enjoyable time doing that. And that got me very interested in the antiquarian movement of the 17th century, which I always have been interested in since.
And you won that prize.
Yes.
So you no doubt got a first, and the end of your time as an undergraduate. Then what happened?
Well, then I was quite sure I wanted to be an academic. Visions of the bar exceeded. And I got, or had got by the time I took schools, what they called a senior scholarship at St. Antony's College, which was, of course, a pretty new college then, and also was for people working on really 20th century history and politics. But Bill Deakin, who was the warden of the college, I think believed in having one or two people who studied earlier periods to as it were civilize the others. So I had this scholarship, and I went to St. Antony's as a senior scholar, and I was in the process of enrolling to do a DPhil, or probation at B.Lit as they called it, but working up to a DPhil, with John Cooper, J.P. Cooper, who was someone lots of people never heard of these days, but who was a very formidable presence on the Oxford scene. He was a fellow of Trinity, and a very severe critic of other people's work. And I was going to work on, well, originally I was going to do a life of Robert Cecil, but Gerald Hurstfield wrote to say he was about to publish the definitive life of Robert Cecil, which of course he never did, so he didn't do that. So then I was going to study the court of James I. The reason for that was that at this time, this was 1955, the really fashionable historical subject was the rise of the gentry and the social conflicts which had supposedly precipitated the Civil War. And I was going to study the court of James I, I suppose rather in the way that Gerald Aylmer was doing the court of Charles I. But at that point, I got an All Souls, I sat the All Souls Fellowship exam, and I got an All Souls Fellowship. And it was quickly indicated to me that it was pretty infra-dig for All Souls Fellow to be doing a DPhil, and you might, among other things, be examined by fellows from other colleges. So
was this at that time a 7-year fellowship?
Yes, it was 2 years without any commitment, and then after 2 years you had to decide whether you were going to be an academic or to go out into the world. But in either case it was for 7 years. And of course it was really a big turning point in my life. It was, for me, a wonderful experience, and very, I mean, one day as a penniless graduate student, the next day, literally the next day, I was dining with cabinet ministers and judges and so forth, and it was all very heady wine indeed. So then interest fluttered from one topic to another. I moved, first of all, I was going to do something on the antiquarian movement, going back to Anthony Wood, I suppose. Then I was working on religious toleration in the 17th century, and I came across a very strong argument made in the 1640s that you couldn't allow people to choose their own religion because it would break up the family and subvert the authority of the father and so on, and emancipate women and goodness knows what. And that got me interested in the relationship between women and sectarianism in Civil War. So I then published an article on women in the Civil War sects, and that led on to women.
That was in Past and Present.
That was in Past and Present, which was then a sort of young, struggling journal. And they sliced it. It was a large article, which was partly about women and partly about the family, but they said we just have the women part. And by then I was going to work on the history of women. And the first lectures I offered at Oxford, which when you were also, you were encouraged to give lectures, and I'd advertised them in the summer of 1957 as the relations between the sexes in England from the Reformation to the First World War. I was very innocent, unmarried person, I might say, but that's it. And of course, virtually nobody came.
Well, not of course, because now everyone would.
Well, there was a correspondence in the New York Review of Books some years ago as to why nobody came to these lectures, because Alwyn Houghton had referred to it, and she said, of course, well before his time, so people weren't interested. But there was a more robust rejoinder by Fiona McCarthy, saying they didn't come to his lectures because he was a totally obscure figure whom nobody had heard. I think actually, though she was right about that, she was wrong about the reason, because when I went to St John's, which I did the next term, I lectured on Aristotle, Hobbes and Rousseau, which is a compulsory subject, and it was packed out. So I fear it was entirely to do with whether it was going to come up in schools. And I stayed with History of Women for a bit, and wrote an essay which was published as an article called The Double Standard, which I sent to the Journal of History of Ideas. It wasn't really their sort of thing, but I couldn't think of where else to send it, and they published it. So then I was regarded as a sort of sex maniac. And the generally sort of cool reception with which these ventures into the history of women received, I'm afraid led me rather feebly.
Your reputation as a sex maniac was to my advantage, because I told that story of how Christopher, when he heard I was interested in sex and magic, he said to go to see Keith Thomas, he knows more about sex. So that's my idea.
Well, in those days, of course, half the books you wanted to read they were called Phi, in part. You needed special permission to do that. That sort of sat on the desk for everybody.
So there wasn't any feminist agenda in your...
No, not initially, though parties were reading about the subject. I did become, though my friends regard this laugh all away, but I did become rather feminist in the sense that I was quite influenced by Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. And I certainly took the view, as indeed I still take, that men and women are completely malleable, and the characteristics they develop, the activities they follow, are shaped by the culture in which they live, and could equally well reverse roles.
Did you read Margaret Mead?
I read Margaret Mead, yes.
Because she develops this pretty strongly, between sex and temperament.
Yes, yes. Well, I've come to think, I think there are some, I think there are some limitations to that argument, of biological differences which do have consequences. But, and that not all so-called gender is a complete cultural fabrication. I don't think you watch babies and see that. Nevertheless, I was quite radical from that point of view, yes.
So you started, I mean, you weren't doing a DPhil, but you were beginning to work on the history of women, and how did that, this was about the early 60s?
No, we were still back in 1950. I mean, both those Women in Civil War Sex, a double standard, I wrote when I was at All Souls, which was between 55 and 57. And in 1957, I applied for a fellowship at St John's, tutorial fellowship. I could have stayed at All Souls another 5 years, of course. That's I should have. But I moved, and great horror from Christopher Hill when I asked him to write me a reference. He said, St John's. It wasn't quite, as academic a college then as it is now. And I said very defensively, it's a very beautiful college. And he said, with that slight stammer of his, he said, I'd have thought that 3 years at Balliol would have taught you to put the soul before the body. It was that Balliol had a soul. Anyway, I went to St John's, and I was extremely happy there.
You had a pretty punishing regime of teaching, didn't you? I mean, you had 12 supervisions a week and 2 lectures a week.
Yes.
And so terms were...
Yes, but I didn't mind that. And of course, in those days, the research ethic of today really didn't exist, or it hadn't reached St John's. So nobody ever asked me what I was working on, or indeed explained it, and of course some of my colleagues weren't working on anything. And I enjoyed the teaching very much.
Mm.
And I mean, it was, I suppose it was ever so slightly run down, history in St John's, when I went there. And I had some very brilliant pupils straight off.
Mm.
The first pupil was Peter Burke,
Really?
who was a very taxing pupil because his essays took about 4 minutes to read. You read essays aloud, of course.
Mm.
So by 12:05, his contribution was finished. He stayed a bit that way, really. But at the same time, he'd said everything there was to be said about the subject. So for a young tutor, the 55 minutes was a yawning gap, which took some filling. Then there was Brian Harrison and Priest Morgan.
Well, tell me something about Brian, because he had a huge influence on my life later on.
Brian Harrison?
Yes.
Did he?
Well, he lent me all his undergraduate notes when I was reading history, so I basically retyped all his notes to help me in my...
I didn't know that at all.
And he also, his one fact, one card method, he was assiduous
Yes.
abstractor onto small cards, as you know, and to have these filing cabinets full of it, and that had a huge influence on me, right, for another 20 years. So, and I, you know,
I
he's very
didn't
kind.
know about it. I didn't know
he
about
was,
that.
along with you, he was probably the most influential person.
Yes.
Because David Macfarlane, who he shared rooms with,
Yes.
got me through my Latin examination. So that's how I met Brian. So tell me about something about
Well,
Brian.
Brian was the year after Peter Burke, and he was the exact opposite. As to say, his essays would have lost it forever. So I mean, he was equally difficult. There wasn't much left to say either, but at least the hour had been happily taken up by the essay, and I mean, he was the most devoted student and wrote capacious and very well written essays. So he was a model for
He
people
was
too.
an older student. He'd done national service. Well, both of them had, haven't they? Both Peter.
Yes, they both had. Yes, I mean they weren't really very much. They are younger than I am, but not that much. But he, of course, I mean, he became a 19th century historian, and he also did the Italian Renaissance special subject. So I did less with him than with Peter, I suppose, at that stage. But I've always been close to Brian ever since. He...
Did he play a part in your election as Master of Corpus, did he?
President of Corpus, yes. Certainly, I mean, it was he who approached me in the first place, I'm sure. Yes, I think he orchestrated that, I'm quite sure. Yes.
I mean, you said you enjoyed teaching very much. I mean, did you enjoy both the supervision and the lecturing? Or?
Well, I hated the time preparing lectures, and I'm afraid I settled down into a rather idle rhythm of the Aristotle, Hobbes and Rousseau.
Which I came to.
Which I did revise each year, so that gradually it was like the boat to which every bit has been repaired is in the same boat, and the lectures were a bit like that. Nevertheless, they were the same lectures, and I gave them for 20-odd years. And I had a special subject class which counted as a lecture. So I didn't do much lecturing otherwise. I didn't lecture on history then. I didn't mind that, but it was a sweat. But of course the teaching, I mean, you taught over quite a wide range, and that involved a lot of reading really, and keeping up. So my time was really largely devoted to them. But I found it very, very rewarding.
Do you have any kind of philosophy of undergraduate supervision? I mean, any practices that...
Well, I think they'd all be prohibited now. And the first thing, of course, the prevention then was the people who read their essays. Also their handed reading lists, preferably with the page numbers in the books and the library shelf mark to save them trouble. Whereas the reading lists I gave were oral. And I said, well, now there's so-and-so, such and such. you in a little book and say it's an article from 1975, 45. Now it is all very much more streamlined, and it's all it's quite clear what the syllabus is. It wasn't at all clear what the syllabus was in my time, and I was like Christopher Hill. I was keen that people should, if they wanted to write a particular subject, should do so. Though I think I was a good deal more concerned than he to make sure that it was all going to help in the end. I mean, the Christopher Hill method was all very well for people who were fairly self-motivated, but there were a lot of thirds in Balliol who would have got seconds in another college. Whereas with my less imaginative system, there were many thirds.
Do you think it's improved as a result of being given much more formal guidance?
No,
now?
I don't. I don't. I think it's technically more efficient and it produces ever better exam results. So how much grade inflation is, I don't know, but the results are the figures are quite extraordinary now by comparison to what they were. But I think it leads to less intellectual initiative. And that somehow is reflected, I think, in academic writing, and far too much academic writing is entirely written within the sort of paradigms of another scholar, and they're sort of modifying it, and so on. That people don't do their own thing quite the way. A lot of them don't, I think, quite the way they used to. And I do feel that has something to do with this type of teaching.
I mean, you weren't encouraged or forced or even asked whether you were doing anything else, but you started doing
Yes.
something else.
Yes. Well, but a lot of what I conducted, I had a special subject class, Commonwealth Protectorate, with John Cooper. And this became a sort of exercise in...
Were you terrified? I could see you always terrified.
Yes. Well, by the end, I think I didn't terrify him, but but it was an exercise in competitive cooking because each alternate weeks, John Cooper spoke and I spoke, and we were essentially delivering research monographs with the other as the main audience. And it was so, and that's how I came to write about the levelers. So I was doing things like that, and then trying to work out the succession. I edited the Oxford magazine in 1961, which is the Don's newspaper, and that was when I reviewed Evans Pritchard's lecture pamphlet on history and anthropology and history, as it's called. And I wrote an enthusiastic piece on that, which Lawrence Stone asked me to expand for a seminar he was running, and then to publish in Past and Present. So I suddenly found myself the person who was sort of applying anthropology to history, sort of. But I was still pottering along with the levelers and mid-17th century history in no particular direction. And it was when pursuing a leveler for the purpose of one of these classes with John Cooper, Richard Overton, and I found that there was a manuscript in Bodley relating to Overton. But the manuscript was pinned inside one of William Lilly's case books, the astrologer, asking Lilly whether he thought it was a good idea for him, Overton, to go on being a leveler. And this, of course, drew my attention to astrology. And then one of the problems which people often went to Lilly was that they thought they were bewitched. So so that really was how I got launched on religion and Islam and magic.
And so these two streams, the Evans Pritchard, and perhaps did you read any of his stuff on witchcraft at that time? Or?
Yes, and indeed, well, I read the purpose of this writing these articles, or writing this article on history and anthropology, I read quite a lot. In fact, when I sent an off-print of the article to E.P. Evans Pritchard, I had a characteristically sardonic note back saying, thank you very much. He said, you seem to have read more anthropological works than I have, but I find them very ill written.
Did you meet him? And
Yes. I mean, he was at All Souls, of course, so
Oh,
not,
yes.
not a very conspicuous... I wasn't All Souls then, but I went in sometimes. Yes, I knew him, though I wasn't close. And I didn't find him a totally sympathetic fellow, I have to say. But I did haunt the Institute of Social Anthropology, and gave papers there. So I knew the Leonhards and Rodney Needham, Peter Riviere,
John Beattie.
John Beattie, certainly. Yes.
You didn't go to any lectures or?
I used to go to some of the. There was a Friday, was it night? Anyway, there was the seminar.
Yeah,
which I used
Fridays.
To go. Yes, I used to go to some of them.
So you started on. This was.
In the mid '60s now.
Well, you were already working on this when I met you in '63. So
Yes.
You've
Yes.
begun.
Yes.
Well, tell me, since we come to religion and the kind of magic, tell me the theme of the book. So for the more general, it's a huge book, so just pick one or two bits for a general audience who are interested in your work. I mean, what was the question behind the book, or the questions?
Well, I'm not sure it started that way. I'm not sure there were any
It must
questions.
have ended like that.
It was essentially descriptive. That is to say, I was led and began, as I say, with the astrological casebooks, not just Lily's, but others which are in Bodley. And this was an aspect of 17th century life with which I was fairly unacquainted. And it became quite clear that it was an important element. And Lilly and his colleagues had over 2,000 cases a year, and people from all places in the social scale, and coming to him for help or advice on a very wide range of problems. So I suppose the first question I asked is, why did they go to astrologers? And what was it about astrological practice which made it so popular? And to answer that question, I drew a certain amount by analogy on what African diviners did and why they were put in. And then one of the problems was whether they were bewitched. And witchcraft, although there had been writings about witchcraft I thought was a seriously understudied subject and obviously quite a preoccupation of the time. And since it wasn't a preoccupation of our time, the 20th century, why was it then? And then that pretty quickly brought up the question of the relationship of these practices to the orthodox religion of the day. And I came to the view that the orthodox religion of the 17th century had been purged of a good number of its, quotes, magical elements, which had been very conspicuous in the later Middle Ages, in that people, quite frankly, turned to religious remedies for practical, what they thought would be practical help in daily life, a notion which Protestants very strongly repudiated, and indeed which probably some high Catholic intellectuals had also repudiated, but it was the Protestants made a thing about it. So that was really what it was about.
And the central thesis, which is partly that there was this vacuum created by decline of the magical element in Catholicism, which was for a time filled by, or that was behind some of the excesses of witchcraft and so on, and then it all faded away into science and secularism and so on. Do you still think that's a reasonable overarching framework for, or have you rethought it?
Well, I mean, the first criticism which generally made is that there was more witchcraft in the 18th and 19th century than I allowed for. I persist in thinking that there was a very big difference in the status of village magic, charming, in the 19th century and that in the 16th century. And the fact that the so-called educated classes totally dismiss the whole thing as rubbish is pretty important. So I think that the idea of survival can be overdone. I think that a lot of the functions discharged by the cunning men in the 16th century are discharged by other agencies in modern society. Whether it's the police finding stolen goods, or modern medicine curing people, possibly, or the whole range of consultants and counsellors and psychiatrists and psychotherapists and marriage guidance counsellors and so forth, advisors of one kind and another, who simply have professionalised, or at least perhaps included another profession in place of the old one, and who are really confronted by very similar problems, I think.
One of the difficulties, which neither of us, at least I certainly haven't solved, is that there seems to be a kind of gap. That's to say, the functional substitutes for these people occur about 100 years after the decline of the witchcraft prosecutions and the belief in witchcraft among the educated. So one is faced, I mean, there is some improvement in medical or insurance and firefighting and so on, but not terribly much in the late 17th, early to 18th century, when the witchcraft beliefs among the educated decline. So one's still left. They seem to have anticipated, as it were, the effective means which weren't yet quite available.
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, that's certainly true, and it is in a sense a problem. But the 18th century anticipates the modern secular world in lots of ways, I think. I mean, the position of, the 19th century was in many ways a reversion to religion in a lot of ways. The 18th century English aristocracy were pagan, as it was said, I mean, they were. And their sort of mausolea they built themselves rather demonstrate that. But it all proved it's difficult to explain. But what you say is true. But I can't explain.
I mean, two things about I'm always interested in how people work, and two things that struck me. One was the way in which you read. You read, I mean, you were notable in the Bodleian and Duke Humphrey for having these huge piles of books beside you, and you were going through them extremely fast. And you seem to have an ability to gut books and to take out what you want very quickly. Is that true?
Well, it hasn't changed. I think they closed this afternoon, but on Monday I had about 30 books there. But I do read very fast. Yes, I do. I mean, I have always read omnivorously, and my sort of doctrine really is that to understand the period, you should try to acquaint yourself with all the sources available, for which there are a lot.
But how would you combine that? And it's easy to read very fast if you know exactly that there are 3 or 4 things you want to get out of a book, or you know exactly what you read around it enough to know it duplicates a lot of what you've read already. But you also, rather nicely, I don't know whether it's your phrase, but you talked about reading against the grain. In other words, picking up things which were not at the time necessarily useful for what you're reading, and saving those as well.
Yes.
So, and that requires a deeper reading.
Well, I mean, you must distinguish the rapid reading I do is largely on secondary sources, and then sort of skim people's articles and books. A 17th century text of any substance I would read more slowly, though I somehow am now programmed that the passages which relate to my interests, which are quite numerous, come out at me, and I can't explain that, but I don't think I missed many. Of course, now this skill, if that's the word, is totally obsolete by the early English printed books. and the 18th century collections online, so that any fool now can, as it were, type in witchcraft and get all the references to witchcraft in English, well, it is, there's a great number of them, in English printed literature in the 17th and 18th centuries, so that these skills, are the skills they are, to some extent now obsolete.
To some extent,
So only to some
because
extent.
another example you give is, just stuck in my mind, is of a sermon in which the preacher talks about you mustn't be like foolish children who sail their paper boats on ponds. Now, you know, with a search engine, you wouldn't know to.
No, that's perfectly true, and of course, the search engine only picks up words; it doesn't pick up ideas.
Yes, exactly. So there's still some room for us.
Fortunately.
The other thing is, which as you know is mutual interest, but the religion, the decline of magic, is vaguely, no doubt, has been likened as Fraserian in a sense, or Christopherian, if you like, in that it has a vast bibliographical apparatus and footnotes and so on, and shows the vast reading, and as does your most recent book. How was it that you kept references? I mean, Christopher just used to write at the back of his books pages reference, so he knew it was in this book, and then he could find the page. How did you index all this stuff?
Well, it's not the past tense, it's the method I still use, I'm afraid. When I read anything, I make notes, and if it's a book, I put the page number on the left-hand side, and then I copy out what I want to copy out. So manuscript, put the folio number. And so then I might emerge with, say, on some 17th century sermon, I might emerge over 2 pages with perhaps 30 different points. And then when I get home, or have a moment, I get out a pair of scissors. Well, first of all, I did say a sermon by William Perkins, published in 1605. I put Perkins 1605, Perkins 1605, Perkins 1605, all the way down. Then I slice it up. And then I file them away in different envelopes according to the topic they relate to.
You don't write in a heading, a subheading of the topic, in other words?
Well, I can see when I don't need to, that would only be, I don't need for me to see they're all about adultery, say, or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, of course, this is potentially a terrible method, because the obvious objection is you completely lost the context. And for a time, I found it very laborious, I used to keep 2 copies, one, the original set of notes, unmutilated, and the other, the bits of it, so that I could then look at
You photocopied them all?
Yes, but I found that too expensive for the book, so I don't do that now. But what I do is when I use any of these, to the extent of actually publishing it, I go back. I mean, I never publish anything without checking every footnote. And I go back and I look at the context, which is very time-consuming. But
because that was one of the main criticisms made by J.H. Hexter, wasn't it, of Christopher Hill's
yes,
method, which is rather
well,
similar.
Christopher, I think, didn't go. In fact, Christopher was not tremendously accurate in his footnotes. And he really did quote out of context. I mean, if I quote out of context, it's not on purpose. But I am very self-conscious about the fact that this method could lead to decontextualized discussion.
How do you get over the problem which I had, because I don't know whether Brian got this method from you, but anyway, Brian's method was in little cards, and I found that my categories, the way I was placing all the material into envelopes, so to speak, or my interests and categorization of the world shifted over time. So what I found after about 20 years of this was my system was unuseful, because I couldn't I had to reconstruct my mental archaeology of, say, 20 years ago when I was reading to refine things, because they were in the wrong envelope.
No, well, that's absolutely right. That certainly is a very serious problem. My conceptual scheme, if you dignify it by that name, doesn't stand up very well these days. All we do is try and keep the whole thing alive by looking at these adverbs quite often, and then taking things out and calling them something else. And it is, of course, also a problem that one particular passage might relate to half a dozen of these topics.
Exactly. You see,
well, it's all. I mean, it's all highly imperfect.
And the other problem is that beyond about, I reckon, roughly 20,000 slips or cards, the difficulty of filing stuff away, because each time you have an extra thing, the difficulty becomes exponentially greater. You know, the system, I found I was spending so much time trying to think of what subcategory to file things under.
Yes.
I was just worn out and gave up filing things. Do you have large piles of unfiled slips?
I'm afraid so. I'm afraid so. I have boxes of them.
That is.
And I mean, I always, you know, whenever I can, whenever I have a spare moment, I'm going to start, and then I can't go anywhere. But my determination is to.
Because I've got some of Fraser's notebooks, and he used a similar method, and they haven't even been torn. Only the little slips haven't been torn up or anything. Obviously, towards the end, he or Lady Fraser ran out of energy. So these.
Well, yes. I mean, the great example that I never looked at was Lord Acton.
Yes,
course.
Exactly. I was thinking the dust mats
yes,
in the
quite,
air.
Quite. Well, it's very difficult, but what is the
alternative?
What is the alternative? The alternative is to have a lot of research assistants, and that I've never had.
Well, let's move on. You taught at St John's for how long?
Well, I went there in 1957, and I became a professor, ad hominem professor, in 1986, and held that for 9 months, which was a record at the time. And then went to, so it was very late, it was 29 years, I suppose. A long time, yes.
Is there anything else about that time at St John's which would be worth recording?
Well, it was in many ways my most sort of productive period, really. When I published, I mean, in the 1960s I achieved a certain notoriety with the anthropology article, and then an article in the TLS.
I remember you going away to write that. You went off to Wales. You were panicking about it, and I remember the phone call from Worcester public phone to you, and you said, I can't do anything, I can't read what you've said. I've got to go off to Wales, I've got to write this article. And you disappeared for a few days, and then you came back, and you were relaxed again.
Yes. Well, I've forgotten that. Yes, I mean, it wasn't my idea. I was just asked, I think, who was it? I'm not sure it wasn't Moses Finley. Anyway, somebody came to see me and asked me to write about history and the social sciences. And somehow this turned into a great diatribe.
The tools and
the tools and that wasn't my title. This Churchillian title was given by the editor. And that, of course, terrible pain.
It was a wonderful article. It had a great influence on many of us, including myself. But you've subsequently felt it was too black and white and abrasive.
Yes, I'm a pluralist now about what historians should do. I'm happy for them to do almost anything, and I think we need them all, and they're all, so to speak, God's creatures. And I think you can't manage without. I mean, I have more respect than I did for the old style, tough, EHR type medievalist. But I don't think that's enough. But you need that too. So I'm more ecumenical in general.
You were something of a convert to plyometrics and statistical methods.
Yes.
If you
well, there's a Latin tag, Deo meliora data iore sequo. I see the better, but I follow the worse. So, I mean, I've never practiced that myself, and I don't think, fortunate or unfortunate enough to study a period where I don't think statistics take me very far. On the other hand, I think if you're writing about 20th century history, statistics are important. I do think if quantitative statements can be made with some precision, they're better than those which are not. But I've got less and less quantitative, if I ever was,
At that
in my
time
own writing.
you were very stressing how important it was.
Yes, well, I think it. I mean, it turned out to be perfectly prophetic in the sense that modern economic history is highly quantitative, and rightly so.
But what were you attacked for, so, or notorious for? Was it John Cooper and co, or?
Yes, John Cooper. Was one of these people who were saying, "My friend, Mr. K.V. Thomas." Yes, he and Richard Cobb, Violin, of course. I think they hated the. Well, there's a lot of anti-Americanism in it. I think a bit. They hated the idea of the white-coated American technocrat historian, and they also thought rightly that I'd been insufficiently respectful to my predecessors, and that was certainly true.
There was also a slight, around this time, which leads up to your second major book, sort of shift, I think you described it, from, to a certain extent, British social anthropology to more cultural anthropology.
Well, the other influence on me was the Annales school, not the Annales of hard quantitative history, but the Annales of Lucien Febvre, and what nowadays is called cultural history, though it wasn't an expression then. I think Peter Burke was the first professor of cultural history. Yes, I just happened to find that, I suppose, temperamentally more sympathetic in that I was not much interested in people, in mass behaviour, people of statistics, but I was quite interested in what went on in their heads. Very interested in that. So I got more and more interested in the values, the norms, the tastes, the outlook, mental assumptions of the people at the time. And I suppose most of my work after 1971 was a sort of move towards an ethnography of a kind, but a very untheoretical ethnography, descriptive ethnography of early modern England, which almost any aspect interests me, which quite a number of different aspects I then wrote.
Now you mentioned Lucien Febvre, but not Mark Bloch, but
Yes, well, yes.
I don't know if you had to go to your desert island with your favourite historians, and the greatest historians who admire or who will influence you. You had just two or three of them. Who would you choose?
That's quite difficult, and we will now have what you would call a significant pause, because I haven't. I suppose I just don't think like that. Really.
You don't have
I have the same reaction. People say, "What are your favourite novels?"
You don't have hero figures and models.
I don't consciously have any models. No, not really. There were books at the time which I thought were marvellous. I thought Louise Montagu was a marvellous book. It was absolutely panned by the medievalists because of its cavalier use of the sources. But it struck me as an exemplary attempt of what historians of a vanished age ought to be doing. I like that very much.
That little story is very... I talked to Patricia Williams, who was a CUP person, on CUP, and she was always wringing her hands at why they'd turned it down, especially after you wrote such a glowing
Yes, but
report.
Penguin turned it down too. I wrote a glowing report for both of them, and they both rejected it, as I understood, because it was about an obscure 13th, 14th century French village, and who wanted that? And then Penguin, at great expense, bought it back in a abridged form.
Well, they were almost right. If Giscard or whoever it was hadn't said this, I've been reading this
or
good book,
whoever. Yes, yes.
might have sunk.
Yes. So that I thought was a good. I mean, there are many historians whom I admire, but whom I don't even attempt to emulate because they're not my kind of thing. I mean, I think Dick Southern was a very great historian. There are, I mean, I think Quentin Skinner is a brilliant writer. I think there are lots and lots.
What about Maitland?
I've never, there was there was something in Maitland, I can't remember the passage, in which he rather sort of licked his lips as some sort of wretched serf was sent to the gallows, and it completely turned me off Maitland. I felt his sensibilities were not mine.
That's interesting.
I can't remember where you find that passage, but it is there. So no, and I suppose I wasn't. I mean, that type of legal history was. I recognise it's.
Because you said you were interested in legal history or legal things.
Yes, I really meant the sort of modern legal world. I think. Not Maitland. I'll kick myself afterwards. I will think of people who are books or authors, historians who are absolutely devoted. But for
What
the
about
moment,
Brodell?
I mean,
Brodell's for the
no, so Tawney, I must say, was. I mean, I can see this was a deep influence on me, and I admire very much. And I like the eloquence of that. You must help me use some names. I'll tell you what I think of them.
Well, my two are Mark Bloch and...
Yes, well, Mark Bloch I certainly would regard as a very great historian indeed. And Maitland, I know, is supposed to be the historian's historian, but is
not
for
yours.
me.
You were, I mean, as you moved into this more cultural phase, about that time you were asked to give the Trevelyan lectures at Cambridge, and you came over and I came to those excellent lectures. What was the theme of them and the book that arose out of those lectures?
Well, I suppose the theme was the changing, or to some extent, the changes in the attitudes to the various component parts of the natural world in England between 1500 and 1800, on the attitudes to the treatment of animals, to attitudes to man's place in nature, to the classification of the natural world, to tastes in landscape, ideas of conservation, both of vegetarian inhibitions about exploiting the natural world. It had sort of green implications, I suppose, but I wasn't at all green at the time. That just happened to be, I had a very bulging envelope called Animals, which I looked at.
This was Man in the Natural World, yes, the book, yes. Again, just reflecting back on it, do you think that the central theme, which was that this was probably somehow, some way linked to, possibly one of the causes, the causal links was linked to industrialization and urbanization and the separation of man, people physically from the countryside and so on. That was certainly one of the themes in it. Do you still think this is?
Yes, I do, and I think there my childhood background is relevant because when I came to the town of the city, I was very struck in the difference of people's attitudes to animals. For example, we had dogs. We would never have a dog in the house on the farm. Absolutely never. I remember also being, actually I was appalled at the time, we had horses who were gradually replaced by tractors. Before they were replaced by tractors, they used to pull these very heavy loads of hay or wheat or whatever. And that was often quite difficult because the carts were loaded and stuck in the mud, and the horse strained and couldn't pull it. And I remember I was very appalled seeing somebody take a pitchfork and beat the horse like that to get it to move. Now that was something, and of course I don't doubt you saw something like that with London cabbies probably in the 19th century, but you wouldn't see it today. And I did feel that the different sensibilities of urban people come from the fact that they are not, in the way that they appreciate, immediately materially dependent on either the countryside, which they value for its appearance or recreationally, or on animals, because they don't actually see the process of converting them to meat or anything like that. So I think it's a fundamental difference.
Well, we've only got about 10 minutes to hear, and a lot of your life to cover, but the Corpus, president of Corpus, you sort of implied that this was intellectually less productive period because presumably you were very busy with running a college.
Yes, I went to Corpus in 1986 and stayed there till I retired in 2000. And during that period, I took on a great number of other responsibilities too. I developed unintentionally a bit of a London life. I was put on the reviewing committee for the export of works of art. And then I became a trustee of the National Gallery and later of the British Museum. And I was on the Historical Manuscripts Commission. There was only Pooh Bah there. And meanwhile in Oxford, I'd been a delegate of the press since 1980. And I became chairman of the Finance Committee, which is essentially chairman of the press, in 1988, which I held then till 2000. And I was also president of the British Academy for 4 years in the 1990s. So I was Pooh Bah then. And it's a wonder I got anything done at all.
Yes, I mean, well, and you took them very seriously. I mean, I remember at your party when you left the press, they said that you tended to read almost all the books that were submitted to be published.
Yes, yes.
That's a vast.
Yes, well, I found it interesting and educational. I was also, the other thing was it chaired the supervisory committee of the Dictionary of National Biography. That was quite a big thing.
And earlier, maybe it was earlier on, that you were on various university commissions to look at this.
Yes, whatever is on. Yes.
And as a head of house, you'd also be on
a
lot of university committees.
But they cancel each other out in a way that they each provide you with an alibi for not going to the other one. But it did mean, of course I had a secretary, which made a lot of difference.
Well, just one secretary with all those jobs.
Well, yes, I was cosseted when I retired from Corpus. I hadn't been in the post office for 14 years.
You clearly, I mean, all these trusteeships and chairmanships and so on, you enjoy that kind of committee administrative work.
I suppose the truth is I do, or did. Not indiscriminately so, but first of all, they were all concerned with activities which I thought worthwhile. And I also felt I had quite a good time at St. John's and ought to be putting something back into it all. But also, you have the illusion of doing things and seeing immediate results, which of course it is largely an illusion. And I like the sociability of it. I mean, I met all sorts of extremely interesting people in the context of all this. Made many friends that way. But it's a great protection against anxiety committee work. You're not sort of sitting at your desk wondering what on earth is the answer to this insoluble
well, this
problem.
is a problem with retirement, I'm told. It hasn't happened to me yet, but there's nothing to stop you worrying about what you should be doing.
No, I haven't found it a problem
Good.
at all.
Good. Well, I've got two further particular questions. One is about your family, about Valerie. And I have pictures of you sitting up with Valerie at night reading Pepys's diary together. So it was obviously a very close relationship.
Yes.
She was a teacher, or?
Yes. She taught in various schools, but for most of the time she taught in English literature or English in the Oxford High School, where she had the Oxford High School with many able pupils. She had more probably distinguished pupils than I. Certainly, and that was quite a demanding job. It was teaching English, unlike teaching mathematics, involved some enormous amount of marking. So she was sitting up later, not reading Peter's diary, marking things, and I was going to bed. But yes, I mean, she reads everything I write.
Does she? And gives you valuable feedback. And you had some children?
Yes, I had some children. I had two children. A daughter, Emily, who's a classics don in Cambridge, and a son, Edmund, who is a lecturer in Roman architectural history in Durham. And some grandchildren.
You've got grandchildren as well?
Yes, 3 grandchildren.
A delight, or?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And they are, these two of them, anyway, probably all are exceedingly musical. One of them sang the opening in your King's Festival, I Lesson the Carol, was the soloist for Once in a While David City.
Really? When was this?
Only a year or so ago.
Oh, I must have heard it
2 years ago.
How nice. Lucky I didn't know how to leapt up and said hi. The other question, I mean, is about your more recent work. You've just published another book. Again, what was the theme of this, and what were you trying to do in this book?
Well, what I was trying to do was to deliver the 4 lectures which I'd been asked to do. I'd had been asked long before that, and for various complicated reasons involving other people, it was put off. So I wasn't quite sure what to give them on, but I had a good number of topics which I had worked on, and so I did, to some extent, rather cobble them together and called the book The Ends of Life. And they are a series of studies in the values and objectives which people at all social levels pursued either consciously or unconsciously. So there are extended discussions of military press as a sort of form of masculine fulfillment, or work as, again, a source of fulfillment as well as a curse, or material wealth and possessions, honour, reputation, friendship, posthumous fame. And they again are based on quite extensive reading and are meant to be a further contribution to this ethnography of early modern England.
And now?
Well, I have to put together 3 volumes of essays, some which have been published before, some not. And I also gave some lectures in Jerusalem a few years ago which have to be published. And they are on civility and ideas of civilization in the early modern period.
The 3 volumes, has that got a title yet, or will they have separate titles?
I think it's got an overall title of Approaching the Past, and then it's broken up into different heads.
Oh, wonderful. That's excellent. We've only got 3 or 4 minutes, but I often ask distinguished academics at the end to give a little bit of advice to starting scholars, as it were if I was your PhD student coming, or DPhil student coming to, and you were giving me my first supervision about how I should approach research and history and writing and so on. Do you have any?
Well, the first thing I would say would be, are you quite sure you really want to be an academic in this country in the present circumstances of the universities, because they've changed so much, and they are much more regulated, and I think much less satisfying. I had wonderful freedom when I was at St John's, and could go at my own pace. Now people are expected to lay eggs with great regularity, and I think that means that universities are not quite so obviously the home for the more questioning spirit. So I say, first of all, you were quite sure you were going to do that. That is my first advice. And after that, I'd say avoid all my mistakes and don't fritter your energies in lots of different topics, but you stick to one thing, see it through.
Stick to one thing.
Well, I mean, I mean, I've never been very specialised, and specialisation seems to be become.
But you've enjoyed it enormously.
Oh, very much, absolutely. I wouldn't have done anything else, not even being a naval captain.
You're more a fox than a hedgehog, would you say?
Yes, indubitably. Yes, I don't know any single thing.
Any great thing. Well, I think that's a very nice point perhaps to end. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.